Welcome to Medicaid Matters, the only live talk show about the business of Medicaid health care. And now, here's the host of Medicaid Matters, Richard Yaden.
And thank you, Braley, and welcome everyone to another episode of Medicaid Matters. Thank you for taking some time this Tuesday afternoon to be here with us. I'm Richard Yaden, President and CEO of Managed Medicaid Services and the host of Medicaid Matters. We'll be spending the next hour together here, and we're going to try to explore some of the perspectives, some of the insights as to what it means if the Supreme Court decides to take down the Affordable Care Act and what that means to Medicaid itself. If this is your first time listening to Medicaid Matters, then it's not uncommon for several hundred other Medicaid interested listeners to be joining you today. You can get more information about our show at www.medicaidtalk.com. That's where you can also go and listen and watch past shows. We do stream the show live on Ustream TV, but you can watch it right there at medicaidtalk.com. You can read more about our guests. You can receive show updates and just an opportunity to join the Medicaid Talk community. As popular as the show has become, I really feel we are just beginning to scratch the surface. So make sure you invite a colleague to be a part of the Medicaid Talk community and to participate in this show. You know, one of the reasons I think our show has become so popular within the ranks of Medicaid listeners is that we're a live broadcast. And we have the ability in our show to interact with our viewers and with our listeners. The easiest way to do that is just to give me a call, 626-657-2125. That's 626-657-2125. That's the number that will reach you or get you right here to the show. We'd love to have your comments and opinions, especially about today's subject, which I think there are a lot of opinions out there, a lot of great ideas, a lot of thought, and we're going to hear from some experts in just a few minutes throughout the show today on just what the impact to Medicaid could be if the Supreme Court rules to strike down the Affordable Care Act, or even if it just strikes down the Medicaid portion and keeps the rest of it. We'll take any calls throughout the show today. You can join me right here on the air with those comments or even questions. Well, what did you think about the Supreme Court hearings a few weeks ago? Will ACA survive? Will it be struck down? And just what does that mean for Medicaid, especially for Medicaid expansion? It's a complex subject, there's no question about it. And given the mystery over just what the court may decide to do, these questions are going to be pretty tough to answer. And if you're working in Medicaid today, I know that they're on your mind. And today we're going to try to get some expert perspectives about this interesting and important topic. Now, some of you I know have really had a chance to dig into this issue. You've had an opportunity to analyze it. You have formed some very fact-based and careful observations about it, some insights, some opinions. And if that's you, then we'd like you to participate in the show today. We'd like to hear what's on your mind about this subject. But many of you have just been, frankly, too busy to dig into this. You're aware of the issue, of course. You've got a good grasp on what's going on, but just haven't taken the time to flesh it all out. And fortunately, you're listening to me today, and that is just what we're going to try to do here in the next hour. You have a question about this, just give me a call. Let's see if we can't get to the bottom of it. So, excuse me. So what happens if the Supreme Court rules that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional? We're going to primarily deal with that issue today from the standpoint of what could happen to Medicaid. However, I think it would be a disservice to not spend just a few minutes looking at the Supreme Court and the broader Affordable Care Act and all the implications of what the court might do with that. Because as you know, we are about Medicaid here on the show, but there's a lot of ripple effects that this would have throughout Medicaid, even if the Medicaid expansion piece, the Medicaid mandate in the Affordable Care Act, survives and stays with us. So what is the likely impact then across the broad spectrum of health care if the entire law is struck down? Well, we know that there's going to be a lot of upheaval in the industry, especially with insurance companies who have spent the last several years really gearing up with the momentum and really aligning operations, aligning policies, practices toward the law's revisions into healthcare. And it's likely that many companies would drop some of the major provisions that have been demanded by the law. Things like the ability to stay on a parent's policy up until age 26, and certainly the mass expansion of coverage to the estimated 30 million uninsured is probably something that would have an impact as well. It's probably it's probably a fool's errand, frankly, to try to accurately predict what the court's ruling is going to be, and we're just going to have to wait until the end of June to hear what the announcement is. the announcement is. But there are some things that we can take away from the 3 days of the court's hearings. There's at least 5 things that I can think of that we can take away from what we observed during those 3 days at the end of March. The first thing that we can take away is that everything centers on the individual mandate. Now, as you're probably aware, the mandate was struck down by the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, but there were 2 other courts that upheld the individual mandate. During the hearings, all of the Supreme Court justices spent a lot of time trying to sort through how closely tied this individual mandate, to the rest of the law's provisions. And it would seem to suggest, based on that line of questioning, that if the individual mandate goes, then maybe the rest of the law goes with it. Another thing that we can take away from the hearings last week is that it was the government's position, not the challengers, but the government's position, that was on the hot seat. And this is especially evident by Justice Kennedy's remarks that the government had a, quote, heavy burden in defending the constitutionality of the mandate. And in the same sense, or that same sense, was also on display when the questioning turned to the Medicaid expansion mandate. And it seems that the questions, and many of the questions, especially from Justice Kennedy, were challenging the government on this as well. A third takeaway, I think, from the hearings is that we're going to get some answer in June. I don't think the Supreme Court is going to wait until the individual mandate penalty actually goes live in 2014. There's at least one instance of case law that was cited that would allow the court to rule before that actually takes place. A fourth thing we can take away is that Justice Kennedy is the one to watch and is likely to be the deciding factor in whatever ruling comes out from the court. Now, according to Lyle Dennison, and Lyle Dennison is Dean Emeritus of the Supreme Court Press Corps, he has been a 54-year observer of the court, and he said that Justice Kennedy's questions could prove to be the best indicator of how the court will decide. And then finally, I think there is some possibility that Justice Roberts could go either way. There were times during the questions where he seems to agree both with the challengers and with the government on various issues. So, needless to say, this is going to be a historic ruling. I think everybody's ears are going to be tuned to this at the end of June when it's announced. The justices throughout the hearings were unusually lively, and they quoted everyone from Jack Benny to James Madison. Now, some of you know Paul Gianfrido. He's been a guest on our show. Paul is a former Vermont state legislator. He has presented state policy viewpoints to APHA, to the National Conference of State Legislators, the National Center for Health Statistics, to the CDC, the National Association of County and City Health Officials, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officers, and so forth. Paul has, as I said, a former state legislator, is now a policy consultant and healthcare consultant in Florida. He recently wrote what I think was just an excellent article. It was entitled, How We Really Hope the Supreme Court Rules on the Affordable Care Act. And what was really interesting about this article is that Paul addresses the many perspectives that all the different factions are vying for, and how all the different factions, all the different parties in this conversation are hoping for action or maybe inaction on the part of the court. Now, you can find this complete article at www.managed Medicaid Services. Paul is a guest blogger for our company's website. We also have a link to his blog as well on there, so if you want to read this whole article. But some of the things I thought were really noteworthy from a broad healthcare perspective is that, first of all, there is a great deal of division, not just in the healthcare community, but in our country about which way we should go with the Affordable Care Act. There was a Kaiser poll, and this is in Paul's article as well, so you can see that really shows how people are divided. But if you think about this, there are really three competing minority camps that when you take it all into healthcare reform in general, there are really three camps. One of them believes that the ACA represents the best compromise for insuring people. There's another faction that would say expanding reform to a single-payer system like those favored in other developed nations would be the best way to go. And then there are others that say replacing ACA with a private market-based system is market-based system is at least worth a try. Now, there are several different ways you can look at how the court might rule. Again, we're talking about this from the broader perspective, and then I want to narrow this down into Medicaid. For instance, if you're in favor of a single-payer, kind of a Medicare for all program, then you want the court to find that the individual mandate is unconstitutional, but severable from the rest of the bill. However, if you want to reduce the size and the scope of Medicaid programs, then you want the court to rule the Medicaid expansion is unconstitutional, but keep the individual mandate constitutional. Now, if you're someone who wants more universal coverage, but you really don't care whether it's public or whether it's private, then you want the court to uphold the entire law. If you have a child that has a chronic condition such as diabetes, mental illness, or cancer, something along those lines, then you may not care whether the individual mandate is constitutional or not, but if it isn't, you want it to be severable from the pre-existing condition coverage and the community ratings portion of the law. If you're an early retiree and you're on your former employer's health insurance, then you want any provision to be found unconstitutional and not severable from the pre-existing condition and community rating portions of the law, and for that to be severable from the rest of the law. If you're a Medicare recipient, then you want any provisions found to be unconstitutional, that are found unconstitutional, to be severable from the Medicare expansion. And if you want insurance that will cover you in the long term for long-term care needs, well, frankly, you're out of luck. Why? Because that was struck down before the law was ever implemented, and we really aren't hearing anyone talk about restoring that at all. Now, if you want to read the entire article that Paul wrote, then you can go to managedmedicaidservices.com. You can see that entire article there. There's also a link to his blog, and I believe also if you go there in the Medicaid Talk section, you can hear the show that he did with us last year, which is a very interesting show from a state perspective. All right, so what does this have to do? What happens to Medicaid if we find that the expansion, at the very least, is unconstitutional, if the court finds that? Or what happens to Medicaid if we find that the entire law is unconstitutional? Well, popular thought about the Supreme Court and Medicaid seems to suggest that it is going to be an all or nothing. Either the Affordable Care Act stands and therefore the Medicaid mandate stays in place, or the law fails and it outgoes all of the Medicaid expansion plans, at least those that are legislated thus far. Well, when we come back, we're going to let you listen to a conversation I had with Paul last week about this very subject. There may yet be another scenario that could sustain Medicaid expansion even if the entire Affordable Care Act is ruled unconstitutional. So stay with me.
Elevating the quality of care with less cost. Today, that's the job of every Medicaid managed care company, but it can't be business as usual. Companies have to coordinate care a different way. The solution is managed Medicaid services. Through our virtual case manager network, our teams of Medicaid assessment specialists, and our new Advanced Care Transitions program, companies can dramatically raise the quality of care without increasing their cost. Visit us today at MedicaidServices.net. Managed Medicaid Services, your best source for innovative care management.
The Medicaid landscape is changing fast, and that means challenges, but it also means opportunity. Opportunity for you. And that's why you need to visit MedicaidJobs.net. MedicaidJobs.net is the place to showcase your talent to Medicaid companies, search for jobs, research the latest career trends, and register for the free Career Optimizer service. Don't wait. Go to MedicaidJobs.net today.
And welcome back to Medicaid Matters. This is the only live and interactive talk show about the business of Medicaid. You know, MedicaidJobs.net is becoming the place for the Medicaid community to go. It's a place to go if you want to post jobs, if you want to research new careers and new opportunities, if you want to accelerate the next step in your career, then that's the place to be. Our firm is currently working on hundreds of jobs for Medicare and Medicaid organizations. Many of them can be found at MedicaidJobs.net. If you don't see what you're looking for, then give us a call at 866-371-0687, extension 210. All right, so the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion, is it all or nothing? If the Supreme Court says ACA is unconstitutional, or if they say that the Medicaid mandate is unconstitutional, does that effectively end the expansion we have all been planning for? Not necessarily, says Paul Gianfrido. There may be another scenario we haven't heard a lot about that may actually propel Medicaid expansion beyond what even the Affordable Care Act initiated. Last week I had a chance to talk with Paul of just what becomes of Medicaid if the Supreme Court rules against the Affordable Care Act. So here's a part of our conversation.
When the state of Florida Attorney General, on behalf of the 24+ states, filed the Supreme Court Supreme Court brief to get the Medicaid portion ruled unconstitutional because of that coercion aspect that she was concerned about, she put into her brief a number that said that for Florida, the Accountable Care Act and Affordable Care Act would be worth about $1 billion, and it would cost Florida about $1 billion for that Medicaid expansion. But in fact, when you looked into the body of the brief, $574 million of that was for currently eligible but unenrolled people in the Medicaid program, and only $351 million of that was Florida's share of the cost for the newly eligible program participants. So the interesting issue that's raised by this is no matter what the Supreme Court decides about the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act and the constitutionality of the Medicaid expansion in particular, Florida is still on the hook for about $500 million of additional Medicaid costs for currently eligible people who are eligible but unenrolled. And that problem's not going to go away.
So that wouldn't have nothing to do with whether there even ever was an Affordable Care Act and a Medicaid expansion provision.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, is that the states are attributing these costs entirely to the Affordable Care Act. But most of the costs associated with Medicaid expansion that the states have identified, and Florida's identified $1 billion, Indiana in that lawsuit identified $2 billion. Arizona and Louisiana over $7 billion each. Texas came up with a figure close to $25 billion. All of these numbers include the currently eligible but unenrolled people. And those people, no matter what the Affordable Care Act does, and no matter what happens to that Medicaid expansion, those people are still out there and currently eligible, and they're worth about 60%, if you use the Florida numbers, about 60% of the additional cost. So we're still going to have the potential for significant Medicaid expansion, whether or not the Affordable Care Act is found to be constitutional. And so I think people who are looking at the Medicaid program and wondering whether or not that program will expand will find only one scenario in which the Medicaid program will not expand in the future. And that single scenario is what I'd call the worst case scenario, and that is if in fact the individual mandate were found to be constitutional, but the Medicaid expansion were found to be unconstitutional. That's the only scenario under which we wouldn't see a Medicaid expansion. Every other scenario, constitutionality or unconstitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, we are going to see an expanding Medicaid program in the future because it's still an entitlement. So those $574 million costs that Florida has, those are costs that are out there on the books, and they're going to have to pay them if somebody just goes out and aggressively enrolls those eligible people.
So do you think that if the Medicaid expansion provision of ACA is struck down as unconstitutional, or the whole act is struck down as unconstitutional, do you think there is going to be any kind of momentum from a legislative standpoint to then start enrolling these people who are eligible but unenrolled?
Well, the interesting thing is, I think, whether or not it's struck down, I think that the initiative is not going to come, for the most part, from state legislators and state governments, because they're the ones who are going to have to build those costs into their budget, and they want to avoid those costs as much as possible. I think the initiative is going to come from basically private insurers and others who are now picking up, as part of Medicaid managed care, picking up more of the Medicaid population. I mean, the way to win on picking up more of the Medicaid population, let's be honest, is to enroll more of the Medicaid eligible people. And in the Affordable Care Act, there are provisions that relate to enrollment, the case management, care coordination, enrollment services. When people look at the whole law and look at it being struck down in its entirety, while that's possible, I also think that there's another scenario where even if the major provisions that we know about are struck down, there are certain other provisions of that law around funding for public health, for example, and funding for these navigators and outreach services that are clearly not linked in any way to either the guts of the Medicare or Medicaid expansion or the guts of the individual mandate and all the pieces around that. So even if 80% of the law was tossed out and these other pieces were left in place, then I think that the tools and resources are going to be out there to enroll people who are currently eligible. But one way or another, if somebody goes out and aggressively enrolls people who are currently eligible, the states have to pay. And I think that's something that they need to look at. Now, in saying all of this, I do want to at least offer up that, ironically, the best case scenario for people who are interested in the Medicaid program and are interested in making money off of the Medicaid program, the absolute best case scenario for that group is one that is still possible, that the individual mandate will be found to be unconstitutional, but the Medicaid expansion will be found to be constitutional. Well, it really wouldn't be a good thing for the court to strike this one down, really for more reasons than just the momentum behind it. I think that the reality is that people in the 100 to 133% of poverty range don't really have the disposable income to purchase insurance. So those people will go back to being uninsured if this is struck down, because states on their own are not going to move forward and pick up those people on waivers where they have to pick up more of the cost. I mean, I think a second part of this is that really this particular expansion, which a lot of people are forgetting, and really the states haven't done, I think, a very good job in explaining this to people because they've wanted to marshal either support or opposition, depending on which side they fall on for this. But this is an expansion that is paid 90 to 100% by the federal government. So
right.
The federal government was really doing a lot to try to move these people into the Medicaid program without having to put any additional burden on the states. So I think, as you point out, people wisely were gearing up for this kind of an expansion, and one that would move fairly nicely along and was going to be paid for by the federal government, and also carried with it something really rather important, which is the enhanced reimbursement for primary care providers, which has been so needed in the Medicaid program to give people the opportunity to create medical homes again back in doctors' offices and not in hospital emergency rooms and medically underserved areas. So I think there's a lot of those pieces that just won't move forward as well. I mean, we're not going to get more medical homes this way if we don't get this expansion. We're not going to get the federal government to pick up this kind of a share of the program. It's not going to be as simple for people to understand. We're not going to have the uniformity, if you will, across 50 states of moving eligibility up to 133% of poverty. So I think it's going to be much more difficult for those people, the Medicaid managed care companies and others who have moved in anticipation of this expansion, to be able to deliver all the services they hope to deliver. But, and it is a big but, I think there are, in all of those areas, they will find literally hundreds of thousands of people out there who will still be eligible for the program. And if they use the infrastructures that they're developing to go out and enroll those currently eligible people, I think there's still opportunity here, both for the Medicaid managed care companies to make some money off this, which I think is important, and I think be a good thing for them. But also from the perspective of people who just feel like we want to take some of the burden off people who are privately insured and get some of these uninsured people onto the state program, the Medicaid program. I just think that for those hundreds of thousands of uninsured people out there, there will be benefits, and for those people who are insured, who aren't going to have to pick up the cost of those people through their private insurance premiums, there's still benefits for them too. So we lose momentum, but not a reason to continue to move forward.
Paul, thank you. Appreciate you spending some time with us and talking about this very important issue.
Happy to do it.
So what do you think? If you have an opinion about this or a comment on what Paul's saying, give us a call. I'd love to hear it. But he's saying that Medicaid expansion could still continue even without the Affordable Care Act, even if the Medicaid mandate is struck down. Paul cites that 60% of the cost of the projected cost of the expansion actually comes from people who are currently eligible but not enrolled. And if private insurers want to maintain momentum for Medicaid expansion, and certainly the work that they have been doing to capitalize and to be prepared for Medicaid expansion has created a lot of momentum, then maybe the best solution, assuming it's the Medicaid mandate is struck down, is to enroll more of the eligible people. But I wonder if it's just that easy to do, and that would be a great conversation for us to have on another show. Paul also says that the best case scenario for Medicaid would be that the individual mandate is ruled as unconstitutional, but that the Medicaid expansion is ruled constitutional. So what do you think? Why don't you give us a call, and we'll be happy to take your comments and your thoughts about this as well. We're going to take a short break here. When we come back, we are going to hear part of my conversation with one of Washington's most knowledgeable and influential Medicaid experts. You don't want to miss what he has to say.
You're listening to Medicaid Matters on the blogtalkradio.com network. Are you a Medicaid industry expert, state executive, or thought leader? Can you share a perspective about the business of Medicaid that's unique, innovative, or even controversial? If so, you could be a future guest on Medicaid Matters. We are currently scheduling guests, and it's time to share your big idea about Medicaid. Go to our website and send us a message. Tell us what you want to talk about and how we can contact you. Make your voice heard. Make Medicaid better.
And if you are interested in being a guest on Medicaid Matters, there is a very short form. You can go to MedicaidTalk.com, fill that out, and we'll be happy to get back in touch with you and talk about your topic. As you know, we try to bring innovative ideas, we try to bring new ideas and thought leaders from all around the industry to our show, and if that's you, we want to hear from you. Well, let's hear from some Medicaid news headlines from MostlyMedicaid.com.
Looking out at the financial reality setting in, the Florida legislature has passed a bill that would stick counties with $300 million in Medicaid bills. The House GOP budget would overhaul Medicaid, food stamps, and both would use a block grant approach. And finally, under financial reality headlines, Wisconsin lawmakers passed a bill to raise CHIP premiums to a little over $100 a month for families of three making more than $28,000 a year. Health reform cometh. The timetable to implement ACA marches on. Related news items include the Obama administration released the new Medicaid eligibility rules to states. These are the rules they should use when expanding Medicaid under health reform beginning in 2014. Other analysis shows insurers stand to lose big if health reform is overturned. Estimates now show $627 billion in new federal spending for health reform. If the law is overturned, that's a huge opportunity loss for insurers. Under Medicaid managed care news, New York plans to move much of its Medicaid membership to managed care and save $18 billion. They're asking CMS for a waiver to make the change. Under Medicaid pharmacy news, in Texas, Johnson & Johnson is heading back to court to revisit a $158 million settlement. Sources say the attorneys are not happy with their cut and are bringing it back to court. And finally, news under Medicaid and medical homes. There's a new meta-analysis of various studies showing that the evidence for medical home savings is inconclusive. This is bad news as the federal government continues to subsidize these initiatives with enhanced Medicaid funding. For more information on these stories and other great content, check out MostlyMedicaid.com.
And we appreciate MostlyMedicaid.com for providing those news updates to us. You know, they've been a longtime sponsor of the show, and it's been a great partnership with them. You can also be a sponsor of Medicaid Matters. It's not uncommon for several hundred people to listen to this program every week. Each of them are interested in Medicaid and in your message. If you'd like to learn more about being a sponsor, you can email us at info@medicaidservices.net or call us at 866-371-0687, extension 807. And don't forget to join the Medicaid community on Facebook. When you like the Medicaid Talk page, you'll get updates, access to contests, just like the annual bonus that we gave away this past January. You can watch the show live right there from the Facebook page, and you can network with others in the Medicaid community. Just point your browser to facebook.com/Medicaid Talk. Well, we're exploring the subject of what happens to Medicaid, specifically Medicaid expansion, if the Supreme Court rules against either the Medicaid mandate that's in the Affordable Care Act or against the entire law. We've already heard about another scenario that might take place, but you know, there is much more at stake here than just Medicaid expansion. For instance, what becomes of the Medicaid Innovations Program if the expansion provision is struck down or even the entire law is struck down? I don't think anybody on any side of the issue would disagree that the Medicaid Innovations Program is much needed and has been really making some inroads into new ideas. Yesterday, I had a chance to speak with Kip Piper about this. Now, most of our listeners are familiar with Kip and his work. Kip is a healthcare strategist. He is president and CEO of Health Results Group. He's a leading authority on Medicaid and Medicare health reform. He's a senior consultant with Seller Dorsey. He's the past senior advisor to the CMS administrator, state administrator. He's a speaker and author. Really, I could go on and on about the accomplishments that Kip has. he is probably recognized as one of the more knowledgeable and influential people in Washington on this subject. You can certainly learn more about Kip's background at kippiper.com. Kip works in Washington. He has a perspective that is absolutely invaluable. Not only is he able to offer insights on this topic, but he has some interesting things to say about potential election scenarios. So let's listen in to what Kip had to say when we talked yesterday.
Well, it's a very interesting dynamic because you have to look back at what are those component parts of the Affordable Care Act as it relates to Medicaid. And of course, one aspect was the actual expansion. And the latest numbers from the CMS actuaries are actually much higher in terms of the new enrollees that would come in under ACA and the new streamlined eligibility rules. And instead of the, say, 16 million that the Congressional Budget Office has been throwing out in terms of their models, the CMS actuaries are now looking at that by 2016 there'd be 24 million new Medicaid eligibles and 28 million by 2018, 2019. So, a good 50% or more people coming onto Medicaid than originally thought. So that in and of itself is a big deal. The second issue, of course, is that with the Medicaid expansion and everything else, if that went along with the rest of ACA, so would the maintenance of effort. So would be the provision that sort of buffered and prohibited states from pulling back on eligibility. Now, that was put in place, during a time when states were, in a very severe budget crunch, and they're not quite in the same condition, but they're not through the woods yet. So that would also raise the prospect of, because a lot of states were going to the thing that their go-to would be, normally would be dropping benefits where they could in terms of optional benefits, dropping provider rates or dropping eligibles, or going to large-scale managed care to save money.
Three.
and grabbing all of them at the same time. And since they couldn't touch eligibility, it sort of put a lot more pressure on their cutting rates. And so that would be something to take a look at as well, is would it sort of have a cascade effect. The other aspect that would go as well would be the CMS Innovation Center and the money and the grants out to providers and states and so forth, such as the money that's been used to help quite a number of states develop integrated options for dual eligibles. The idea of moving towards integrated Medicare and Medicaid plans for the 9 million dual eligibles that account for nearly $350 billion. So that's a separate market segment, and would that sort of slow that? I don't think it would slow it, because frankly states are very eager to move that way, and more eager to move towards integrated options for dual eligibles than, say, even CMS is.
And let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
Because that seems to make a lot of sense, whether it's legislated or not. And
absolutely.
So if you're saying that if they strike down the whole ACA, and then that means the Medicaid expansion piece is out, do you feel like that there would not be any more of that innovation work going on, or is there just too much momentum behind it to keep it going?
Yeah, frankly, I think there's too much momentum, and I'm glad that there's momentum. Frankly, because I agree with you. The idea, because right now dual eligibles in the system and what they have to go through, and the two programs not talking with each other and not working, mechanically at a programmatic level, and the providers and everything else. It's just horrendous, and and we really have evolved to a point where we know what can be done and the advantages of integrating the care and making sure that people get what they need when they need. And of course, we're talking about the most vulnerable beneficiaries of all. So the other thing is, with the ACA, and if the whole law is thrown out, I think it's fair to say that there would be an effort by some, at least some moderates, of which there perhaps are a few in Congress left, that would look at, all right, what component parts of ACA could Congress and the White House agree to reinstate, like, for example, accountable care organizations, the CMS Innovation Center, prevention efforts, prevention benefits with no cost sharing. There's a variety of things like that. The bump up in Medicaid primary care rates for physicians and so on. There's a variety of things in there that presumably are either so far down the road and popular that hopefully even in Washington somebody could reach an agreement. If, say, President Obama is reelected and then the Republican Congress, you really would have to have a kind of a conversation, if you will, to try to get past the roadblocks. If Governor Romney were elected president and let's say the Congress both sides switch over to Republican control, then I think we would definitely see what the Republicans have been talking about for quite some time as alternatives to the, say in the case of Medicaid, the approach of the ACA was, to some degree, was a top-down, but certainly a national approach, a uniform, all things for all people kind of approach in Medicaid, and with their expansion and requirements and so forth. But I think what we would see is a lot of talk about waivers. Block granting Medicaid would certainly become a very high-profile, hotly debated, to be sure, but certainly reasonably high prospects for a concept of block granting Medicaid, which was really last discussed in earnest in 1995 and 96. The second thing would be to provide the states with flexibility to do a lot of the things that are in the ACA. The real question is, what does the Supreme Court, the Supremes, what do they do in, it's likely, but not certain, that they will find the individual mandate is unconstitutional. It is likely, but not certain, that they will uphold the Medicaid expansion. But of course, if they end up throwing out the entire ACA after finding the individual mandate unconstitutional, that too would throw the Medicaid expansion out at the same time. With respect to the health plan industry, I mean, there's kind of winners and losers. You've got quite a number of advantages of ACA to the Medicaid health plan business, and certainly the biggest one is the sheer increase in Medicaid eligibles. We're talking about, on average, if you follow the CMS actuary numbers, you're talking about a 40% increase in Medicaid enrollment nationwide under the ACA, with some states being as little as 5%, say Massachusetts, some states being as high as 50 or 60% perhaps, which would not be unheard of if the CMS actuaries are right, and you get that number of people in states like California, Texas, Florida. And states, just in the sheer volume of that, it makes sense for the states to contract that out. They already are using health plans in most states.
Well, Kip, I appreciate you taking some time and talking through this with us. It's a huge issue, a lot of complexities. I know a lot of our listeners are, they're trying to sort it all out for themselves. And you being there in Washington, I know you're very close to it. You have a history with CMS as well, and I just think your insights are so valuable as we process all this and wait for June. So thank you very much for joining us and being a part of this.
Appreciate it. Take care.
All right. You too.
This call has been recorded.
Well, that's interesting thought that Kip brings forward, that if the whole thing is struck down, there are still potentially some provisions of the law that could be reinstated, although it would require a great deal of cooperation in Washington. I think conventional wisdom is such that not a whole lot is going to get done between now and November if the law is struck down. But I think that he has a very interesting perspective from the standpoint of what happens if Republicans gain control of Congress and the White House. or if the Republicans gain control of Congress and President Obama remains in office, which I guess we could say the election at this point, if you look at the polls, is still kind of a toss-up. But very interesting. The other thing that Kip mentioned that I was unaware of, maybe perhaps some of you were aware of this, is that the estimate of new enrollees under the Affordable Care Act from the CMS actuaries is so much larger than the estimate of enrollees from the Congressional Budget Office. 16 million from the Congressional Budget Office and 24 million from the CMS actuaries. So there's a lot at stake any way you think about it. Well, it's good information. What do you think? What do you think about this? Any comments that we have talked about so far? You just have a few more minutes to share with them. We're about to come up here on our next segment. When we come back after this short break, we're going to hear from one health plan CEO, what they have to say about it, and then an idea that I want to share with you that you probably haven't heard much about, but should really get you thinking about next steps. We'll be right back.
I hope you're enjoying today's show, and I want to remind you that opinions and viewpoints expressed by guests on the Medicaid Matters Talk Show are not necessarily those of the host or our sponsors. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in just a moment.
By providing access to the care they need and the quality they deserve, Medicaid health plans enhance health outcomes of our nation's underserved. Just listen to how a Medicaid health plan made a difference to Miriam.
I was 10 years overdue for my annual mammogram when my Medicaid plan case manager called and convinced me to just do it. The mobile mammography van my plan provided made it simple. Breast cancer runs in my family. That phone call may have saved my life.
Medicaid Health Plans of America, ensuring access to better health care. Learn more at nhpa.org.
Well, this is Medicaid Matters, the only live talk show about the business of Medicaid. We're here every other Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You know, oftentimes our show brings you some of the best practices in the industry that our guests talk about. And we tell you through them how they are solving some of the toughest problems in Medicaid. Well, did you know that the Medicaid Health Plans of America has a Best Practices Center? In fact, they just recently launched a webinar series that is attracting a lot of attention. Now, why? Well, it's because the content is just excellent. And I'd like to give one of our listeners a chance to attend one of these seminars, one of these webinars, Compliments of Managed Medicaid Services. Already one of our listeners has been awarded this $150 value, and we're going to give another one away in just a few weeks. Now, the way to participate is to go to MedicaidTalk.com, register for our blog, and then you are automatically entered to be a recipient, a potential recipient of that webinar, Compliments of Managed Medicaid Services. We'll give away another seat soon, so you want to get your name on that list right now. Well, before we finish our last segment here, I think we need to point out, maybe at the risk of highlighting the obvious, but I want to point out something. Let's not kid ourselves. If this wasn't about politics before, this whole issue of Medicaid expansion and the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, if it wasn't about politics before, it's all about politics now. I mean, first we have the president who seemingly tries to preempt the political fallout of the law being overturned. Then we have a federal judge asking for the administration to clarify their view of Supreme Court rulings. The Republicans have offered their version of what needs to be done, and many in the Medicaid community and throughout the other side of the aisle in Congress are adamantly opposed to those solutions. And in all likelihood, very little is going to be accomplished before the election in November if the court moves forward and perhaps scraps the entire ACA. In this politically charged year, it's going to be very easy to lose sight of just what all of us are trying to accomplish in Medicaid. And I don't mean to make light of the important or the importance of the politics that plays out in all of this. I do hope, though, that the real value, the service, and the fundamental principles behind Medicaid health care does not get lost in this fight. Last week, I had Robert Mendonza. He is a president of Aetna Better Health in Illinois on our show as a guest. Now, we were talking about integrated care management and the great work that they're doing there, but it was in the midst of the Supreme Court hearings when that show was broadcast, and I asked him his thoughts about his subject. Now, he's leading a frontline organization day in and day out, and here's what he had to say about the Supreme Court.
If they do strike it down, obviously it'll have an impact. But if you think of Medicaid, that it's obviously going to impact the amount of people that we can get off of uninsured. I mean, it really comes down to do we really want to reduce the number of uninsured, because there is a social cost towards these people that are uninsured. They are getting care, they're not getting good quality of care, and I would maintain that I'm not sure we're really going to be saving in the long term, because I think what we have to do is get people onto the system, promote quality, so that they will get the better levels of care, because there's other pieces in legislation that are really focused on quality around accountable care organizations, which is really trying to coordinate and integrate so much better our health delivery system. So if you take all the pieces of it, I think we've been missing a real opportunity to truly impact the health care in this country, improve quality, and reduce cost.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly I have long advocated that Medicaid is probably the best infrastructure that we have available today to help more people get care. I guess the argument here at the Supreme Court is the federal government actually mandating that states expand it. So I guess I agree with what you're saying, because I think in the long run, the more people we can get into a quality care organization of some sort is going to overall bring the cost down.
Well, before we go, maybe we should think about what should happen, not just with Medicaid, but in our entire healthcare system, if the Affordable Care Act is struck down. After all, I don't think anyone doubts that the way we approach and deliver health care in our country needs to have some fundamental changes. It's been said many times by guests on this show, and I'm sure all of our listeners and viewers have read this comment before, that we don't really have so much as a health care system in our country as we have a sick care. And as any of our longtime listeners and viewers know, I am a strong advocate of increased individual responsibility for one's own health. So much of the quality of our health care can be impacted by the life and the lifestyle choices we make every day. And that, of course, is perhaps a topic for another show. However, I see more emphasis on the part of healthcare organizations to at least educate their members and their customers about this very fact. The solution is obviously much broader and much more complex than just everyone taking more individual responsibility. Perhaps we need to start thinking about solving this problem from a completely different perspective. John Cochran is a professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. This past week, he posed a hypothesis in the Wall Street Journal. It was an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal on what to do on the day after Obamacare, and that was his characterization of the law, not mine. Let me read you a couple of excerpts from what he wrote, because it's pretty interesting, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more when we get done here. He says that this country can have a vibrant market for individual health insurance. Insurance proper is what pays for unplanned large expenses, not regular predictable expenses. Policies should be guaranteed renewable. The policy should include a right to purchase insurance in the future, no matter if you get sick, and insurance should follow you from job to job if you move across state lines. But he asks the question, why do we have such markets? His answer is that because the government has regulated them out of existence. Start with the tax deduction employers can take for contributions to the health insurance policies, but which they cannot take for making contributions to employees for individual portable insurance policies. Continue with the endless mandates, both state and federal, on insurance companies to provide all sorts of benefits for people who would otherwise not choose to buy them. And what about Medicaid and Medicare? 2 words, premium support. The underlying point of premium support is simple. If insurance costs $5,000 and the government gives an individual a $4,500 voucher, that individual would still feel the correct economic signal to shop for cost-effective health insurance and health care. The main argument for the mandate before the Supreme Court was that people of modest means can fail to buy insurance and then rely on charity care in emergency rooms, shifting the cost to the rest of us. But the expenses of emergency room treatment for indigent, uninsured people are not health care's central cost problems. Costs are rising because people who do have insurance and their doctors overuse health services and don't shop on price, and because regulations have salted insurance with ever more coverage for them to overuse. If we had a deregulated, competitive market in individual catastrophic insurance, that market would be so much cheaper than what's offered today that we would not likely even need the mandate. A deregulated health care and health insurance market can work. We can at least start by removing the obvious elephants in the room, all the legislation, regulations, and interventions that needlessly keep prices up, keep competition and innovation out, shelter people from economic consequences of their decisions, and prevent the emergence of real insurance that follows you from job to job, from health to illness, and back. Well, I'm not suggesting that that is the answer. What I am suggesting is perhaps the answer is very different than what we have been thinking about today. Perhaps there are innovations and there are ideas that have yet to reach the mainstream dialogue, but are just as worthy of exploration. And for what it's worth, you can expect this program to bring those innovations and ideas to you, at least as far as Medicaid is concerned. We'll just have to see what happens in June. We're going to have to move forward with whatever comes out and then just go from there. Well, thank you for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, to spend time with our viewers and our listeners. You can now have a much deeper perspective on what the Supreme Court is going to do with Medicaid. If you have any comments or reactions to today's show, you can send them to me on the MedicaidTalk.com page. I read all of them, and I appreciate any constructive feedback that you have to offer. If you've been to MedicaidTalk.com, you know we've got some things that are planned in the future. Our next show is April 30th, and now that's a Monday. It's different than our regular week, which is usually on a Tuesday. So we'll not be broadcasting on Tuesday, April 24th. We will be on April
90 seconds
at the Medicaid Health Plans of America Awards event. We'll be broadcasting live from there and speaking with all of the award winners. If you're going to be there, please be sure to stop by and say hello. And don't forget to go to MedicaidTalk.com and register for the free Best Practices webinar from Medicaid Health Plans of America. It's a $150 value. Just sign up for our blog, and we're going to have a drawing in just a few weeks. Well, this is your host, Richard Yaden. Today is Tuesday, April 10th, 2012. You've been listening to Medicaid Matters, brought to you by Managed Medicaid Services. I hope you have a great week.